Good afternoon. Probably for some of you, this might not be a good afternoon, so you could have your own time. Thank you very much for inviting me to speak here. So what I'm about to speak is about contemporary Islamic activism in Ethiopia and its implication for Christian-Muslim relation. As probably you all know, Islamic activism has become increasingly a concern among the Muslims and non-Muslim communities alike. It's a concern mainly because Islamic activism is often interpreted as a violent and disruptive approach to politics and communal relations. Such understanding equates Islamic activism with Islamism. In this line, for example, David Johnson argues that Islamic activism and Islamism are not distinct because of the sui generis nature of Islam, a religion whose primary goal is to bring the political, social, and moral dimensions of everyday life under the aegis of Islam. The implication of such a view being that all form of Islamic activism is an illusion, since by actively fomenting discontent, it only breeds violence and extremism. Equating all form of activism with militant Islamism is a monolithic, essentialist, and static conceptualization that has a little empirical support. The non-violence activism, among others, include the Dawah, which is the missionary activity related to the reception of the recitation of the Quran, the application of the Sharia, and conducting affairs of everyday life in Islamic spirit. It also includes social welfare, the provision of essential development assistance, education, and health care among the needy Muslims, and as well as charity, the support of the poor. The reform projects of Islamic activism also have an intellectual element, interpretive historical undertaking that aimed at reviving the Muslim communities. This is true to the post-1991 Ethiopia, which is where the new government started to rule here after the fall of the Derg government, the communist one, where the existing ethno-nationalist political atmosphere is generally receptive to revisionist history. The conflation of each and every Islamic activism with Islamism, besides perpetuating the exceptionalism of Islam, it also posits Islam and its text as the problem, and activism is nothing but insisting on going back to the golden age of Islam, where Islam is used to dominate all aspects of life and culture within the Arabic Muslim society. This view of Islamic activism also by framing Islamic activism as a foreign import from oil-rich Gulf countries, it tends to ignore the local factors that shapes it. Indeed, Islamic activism intermingles with local customs, politics, economic and historical conjunctures, which forces us to study it within its own context. The non-violence aspect of Islamic activism, however, have been given a little attention. More so, its contribution to the Christian-Muslim relation is largely ignored. As a result, the characteristics and the dynamics of Islamic activism have not been yet sufficiently understood. In the there is shortage of empirical knowledge, it is no wonder that the nature, the source, and the means of Islamic activism has remained very controversial. Due to the little attention it received in empirical studies, Islamic activism has remained in the margin of social and humanities studies. In defining Islamic activism, I follow Wittwurst in this paper. Thus, Islamic activism is any call for collective actions rooted in Islamic symbol and identities, encompassing the political, social, and cultural activities of Muslim activists in the service of Islam and Muslims. The approach of Muslim activism that I describe is a moderate, non-violent, and accommodationist that works within the existing political system. This paper then is an attempt to contribute to the existing neglect gap. In doing so, I look at the various literary and video productions of prominent activists in Ethiopia. The reason why media is used as a source data is basically because activism is mediated through media. These media sources are significant in the production of cultural meaning uh, and group consciousness among the Muslim communities in Ethiopia. Thus, collective memory mediums that widely circulated among the Muslims are the objects of the studies. So let me begin from the project of rewriting history for historical revisions. What is historical revision? Historical revisionism connotes two diametrically opposite endeavors. Negatively, it is an attempt to skew facts to one's own preference. The typical example is the denial of the Jews' genocide. Such revision presents historical atrocities as a myth. The endeavor is agenda-driven that manipulates the historical records to support one's own ideology. The goal is usually to remove the largest moral obstacles in the impending resurgences. Revisionism, perceived as such, is a pejorative term, seeking legitimacy while promoting one's own view. It is an attempt to distort facts to fit to other commitments, the attempt to blur or erase collective memory. The attempt is mainly driven by ideological and political dishonesty, since it is the thesis, not the evidence, that leads to the conclusion. Positively, reconstruction, it is the re-examination of historical records in order to overturn the bias and exceptionalism of certain national histories. This sense implies that the existing interpretations of historical events need to be re-examined and revised because new sources have been discovered or there is an alternate interpretation of an existing sources. This is thus a necessary endeavor, an update to historical analysis. Such historical attempt is an ethical and moral exercise that shows allegiance to the truth. In this section, we are going to look at the revisionist attempts of Muslim activism in Ethiopia in order to understand its objectives. We ask three questions. One, is it an attempt to overturn the bias of the mainline historical discourses, which are perceived to be against Islam and Muslims? Two, is it an attempt to overturn the exceptionalism of Christian and Christianity? And three, is it an attempt to remove the largest moral obstacles so that they could negotiate a more positive image in the making of the nation? Yes is the answer for these three questions. In order to answer the above three distinct but interrelated questions, we will look at the Muslim activists' critics of the mainline history. This is quite crucial because the activists often contend that their stories have been systematically left out of the mainline historical accounts. This is no wonder because whenever people think of the nation Ethiopia, what they would think of is it is the Christian Ethiopia, despite the fact that Islam have been existing here alongside for the last 14 centuries. And 34% of Ethiopian population confesses Islam as its own religion. Despite this fact, but the main image of Ethiopia remains predominantly Christian. This is more true if you consider that some part of geographically, when you look at Ethiopia, that much of the periphery belongs to Islam and Muslims. So we will look at alternatively, not only we would be looking at this contention, but also we'll look at the alternate reconstructed histories. I would be picking only one as a sort of as an example. So the goal of this reconstruction is to foster the Muslim community's civic identities and pride in the nation where Christianity and their accomplishments are extolled quite a lot, while anything related to Islam and Muslims are viewed very suspiciously. This, among others, requires rationalizing controversial events of the past, hoping that it will diffuse controversy with the Christians. Well, this is very crucial because there were episodic instances in Ethiopian history where the Christian kingdom have been in conflict with the Muslim sultanates, and the atrocities committed from both sides have created such an impasse in one's understanding of the other. So looking at this alternative reconstructing history is also very crucial, often because Muslim activists argue that the Islamic contribution have been neglected and the achievement of the Christians are overemphasized in relationship with the nation Ethiopia. So let me begin from the first, that is the activists' critique of the mainline history. Let us begin by examining the Muslim activists' critique of Ethiopian mainline historical works. Given that any historical revisionism begins with critiquing the available history, the activists' critique of the available history is a very natural point to start. By mainline historical works, what I mean is histories as taught in public school and universities in Ethiopia and abroad. I use the term in contradistinction with the new historical perspective of nationalist historians. These nationalist historians basically uphold the marginalization narratives of the many ethnies which are in Ethiopia, and certain form of contemporary postmodern historicism, which advocates basically a perspectivism. So Ahmadin Jabal, a popular historian and Muslim activist, is very critical of the existing historical works related to Ethiopian Islam. I quote, he remarks, "The way and the process our history is written has non-factual elements, and it shows partiality. To him, what the mainline histories contain about Ethiopian Islam and Muslims is it is an admixture of fiction and fact. Besides that, there is a lot of subjectivity involved in that very process." His negative assessment of Ethiopian history in relation to Islam and Muslims is not unique among Muslim activists. The radio Nagashi, Nagashi is, as you all know, according to Islamic tradition, the first king who has become a Muslim, who also have given an asylum to the first hijrah which have been done to Ethiopia. So this radio program has been named after him. So it's Radio Najashi, which is a diasporic radio station in Stockholm, aired in Amharic, has a weekly program titled Yalteneggerelaቸው የኢትዮጵያ ታሪኮች, translated as Untold Ethiopian Histories. The goal of this program is to bring to light the untold histories of Ethiopian Muslims. In one of the program, the producer states, I quote, "In the front line of Ethiopian nations," they are using the word nations because there are more than 80 ethnies here in Ethiopia, who are called nations and nationalities in Ethiopian constitutions. So in the front line of Ethiopian nations whose histories are suppressed are Muslims, end of quote. To this activists, the voice of Ethiopian Muslims have been silenced and suppressed. Some of the Muslim activists are very vocal in presenting Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Christianity as the major culprit of the historical injustice of silencing the histories of Muslims. Akbar Yimmer, one of the Muslim activists, for example, states, I'm going to quote, this is relatively a bit longer quote. He says this, "In Ethiopia, state and religion has been two faces of a coin. For centuries, the church shaped the type of system that had come to exist. It is often said that political rulers used religion to advance their selfish agenda. In Ethiopian case, however, the reverse seems to hold true. The church has been instrumental in bringing to and sustaining power of that is believed would advance its agenda. As a result, it has positioned itself as a sole guardian of the country and the maker of its history." For Ethiopian Muslim activists, the predicament of the available political history connotes three distinct but inextricably intertwined elements, namely the identity of the historian, their perspective, and the source the historian employed in the construction of the history. The activists, in their effort to discredit the mainline history, they point that the majority of Ethiopian history scholars are Christians. Thus, it is due to the Christian background of the historians that the overall emphasis of Ethiopian history has been the northern Christian Ethiopia and about Christianity. In this line of reasoning, the dearth shortage of work in Ethiopian Islam is because there weren't many Ethiopian Muslim scholars. The activists also argue that the already available history is also devoid of the Ethiopian Muslim perspective. Isaac Ishetu, another Muslim prominent activist who continually writes in national newspapers, which are widely circulated in Ethiopia, puts this sentiment by saying this, I quote, concerning the Ethiopian history, we have our own perspective. From our perspective, our history is intentionally overlooked, demonized, and belittled. Islamic sultanates and their contribution to civilizations were not valued, and more so in the previous states. He is referring the present state, so that's why he's saying more so in the previous state. So that refers to the Derg government and the imperial regimes before that. So the common thread of the criticism of the activists is that the failure of Ethiopian history to incorporate adequately the perspective of Ethiopian Muslims is intentional. In the opinion of the activists, what we have in the available history of Ethiopian is the perspective of the Christians. This kind of assessment is in a contradiction with the criticism that you would find within the mainline history. The mainline history also recognizes that there isn't enough share that has been given to Muslims and Muslims' history, but it associates such, the reason why it is left out, basically because of the existing research paradigm that they have been employing, which is a Semitist centrist research paradigms, which begins the North as a kind of a center against which everything is being valued at. The concern about the identity of historians in the process of constructing history emanates from the nature of the discipline of history. Indeed, there is a complex relationship between historical fact and history. Historical facts are often partial records, and the interpretation of the historian fills the void between facts. The feeling of the fact, which is called analysis, introduces interpretive bias. The historian might either be conscious or unconscious of their own interpretive bias. Now the question is, if interpretations are part of historical construction, and there is a possibility of bias involved, thus re-examination of history becomes a commendable practice. The question is, however, how a historian guards oneself from distorting facts. The revisionist quest should not be to reinforce the existing narratives or react against them. The best way to guard oneself from such a bias is a critical thought. If critical thought is a best guard, what needs to be done is not dismissing the mainline historical constructions only because they are written by the non-Muslims. What we all need is to strive to compare interpretation of facts, comparing facts and seeking the causes of both fact and interpretations. Muslim activists' criticism have also concern about the source of the available history. To them, Ethiopian historical works heavily relied on the Christian royal chronicles and church dogmas. To the activists, given that Ethiopian history heavily relies on Christian sources, the image it produced is distinctively Christian. The criticism is not only that the historical project was incomplete without including the Muslims' perspective, but also in some way biased against Muslims. In a narration of Ahmed Grind documentary, for example, the narrator remarks, I quote, "Our Ethiopian history has been written by the clerks of the church and to serve the church," end of quotation. The implication is that there is a great deal that requires revisions and much more has to be written from the perspective of Ethiopian Muslims. The implication of this critique seems the need for inclusiveness and historical approach. If the call was just that, there wouldn't have been many contentions. In actual practice of reconstruction of the past, Muslim activists have made their business discrediting Christian sources altogether as unreliable sources. Hagiographical texts that portray the lives of the saints and the chronicles of Ethiopian emperors, which are called Tariq and Nagas, and local Muslim and European missionaries and travelers' accounts are the main primary sources for constructing Ethiopia's history. Even if one recognizes the supposed prejudice of the Christian authors and Christian sources, the rejection of the Christian sources in total is not a way forward. What needs to be done is to ferret out the trustworthy element. Moreover, it would be very wrong to replace these sources with Arabic Islamic sources, which are also equally guilty of the same criticisms, which most of the time Muslim activists fall into. What historians need to do is critically engage the existing diverse sources, whether local or external, in order to arrive at a broadly based synthesis. Now, I have provided you the major criticisms that Muslim activists do advance by way of an example to show you how reconstruction is being done. I will take an example. In line with the prevailing political climate, Ethiopian Muslim activists promoted their own heroic figures. One of such figures is Imam Ahmed ibn Ibrahim al-Ghazi, who lived between 506 and 1543. Ethiopian Christians tend to refer him Ahmed Grind, which means Ahmed the left-handed. Ethiopian Muslim activists rewrote their history in relationship with him. Given his negative image among the Ethiopian Christians, however, his story, the rewritten story, invokes polemic towards the church. In relation to him, the Ethiopian Tawhado Church becomes the object of polemics too. The church is said as an institution that tends to demonize non-Orthodox background heroic figures of Ethiopia. In an effort to negotiate the reimaging of Imam Ahmed, the activists side with non-Orthodox religions in Ethiopia. The activists reasoned that the church demonized the 10th century Judith Gudit, a semi-legendary queen of Beta Israel, which means Ethiopian Jews, only because she was a Jew. In a similar line, also, they point that the church painted as an enemy of the Ethiopian Emperor Susunios, who lived between 1606 to 1632, only because he converted to Catholicism. The overall effort of the activists is to dismiss those historical materials that negatively paint Imam Ahmed as a non-Ethiopian and destructive force. Notwithstanding the criticisms that the church historical records have a bias, denouncing all the records of the church as a totally unreliable and picking only Islamic sources that depict the Imam positively doesn't add value for the constructive dialogue. In relation to his image, the painting of Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church is as an institution that demonize anything other than Orthodox Christianity is also unhelpful. In the new historical revision of the activists, the Imam turns from an outside invader to a young man who has a deep love to his country. His brutal actions against Christians in the church are at times rationalized on the ground that they were merely response to the previous injustice and his contemporaries. Others dismiss the charge as inventions. In the new assessment, he contributed to the nation. One of his contributions is the ruling of the nation in accordance with the Sharia law. Ethiopian Muslim activists, even though they don't request the endorsement of Sharia to all Ethiopians, they of it as the best rule that humans could govern themselves with. From his historical legacies, the narratives also discounts the forced Islamizations he pursued. In the narrative, what happened is rather the peaceful re-Islamization of the previous sultanates and those Christians who were willing. Historical areas in the south like Bali, Dawaro, and Hadiya were Muslim sultanates upon whom Christianity was imposed. In the narrative, the Imam is not an invader, rather a hero, fought for defending his and the rights of a fellow Ethiopian Muslims. He is extolled as a great personality that unified Ethiopia from the present Somalia to Eritrea. With the sense of pride, the narrative indicates that he governed Eritrea, Ethiopia, Somalia, and Djibouti. He was a mujahideen, one who struggled for the sake of Allah and Islam. He was a good news for Muslims who were repetitively insulted and mistreated by the Christian kingdom. In the narration, however, his destruction has been overlooked. The narration is also very critical of Ethiopian Orthodox Church and the book written by Abba Mbako. The negotiation with the Christians didn't succeed about the rewritten history. Still, many Christians frame the Imam as a Somali rather than an Ethiopian. Most of Ethiopian Christians, however, still refuse to hold the view that his motivations are primarily economic and his actions are retaliations against the injustice of Ethiopian Christian kings. Among Ethiopian Christians, both the Imam's motivation and the support he marshaled from the Muslim nations signify the face of radical Islam and the danger it poses to the Christian Ethiopia. The sentiment of such views captured in the following quotation. I read a Christian quotation. Ethiopia hasn't yet fully revived from Ahmed Grant's tenderness, a chilling devastation of Muslim forces on Christian Ethiopia. Even though the human and the material cost of these invasions are infinite, what I always regret is rather the loss of some of the oldest church scriptures, only whose titles have remained with us today. The Muslims had no reason to devour Christians except for their jihad. The Christians established and ran the country's government. Some tribes like the Somali and Ifats living in some remote part of the country accepted Islam and they were also allowed to govern themselves while in Ethiopian state. Even when we see it today, what better options were available for the imperial government than this? The main objective of jihad war waged on Christians was to convert them all to Islam, thereby administering them under the Sharia law. The Muslim never thought of taking up only government power and let the Christian rule themselves. Another Christian apologetic remarks about the war. As the name itself implies, one of the destructive wars in Ethiopia was Gran Ahmed's War. This war was a war against Christianity with the sponsorship of Saudi Arabia under the Somali Ahmed Gran. Well, in fact, the Saudi Arabia didn't exist as a nation at that time, but that is how it is portrayed. The period was where many Christians were Islamized, except 1/3 of the populations. Many churches were burned down, and those who refused the conversations were slaughtered. Now, these are the historical reconstruction. Now, what is the implication for the Christian-Muslim relation? So that would be the last topic that I would outline today. With that, I would wrap up. In the context of religious plurality, dialogue plays a crucial role in fostering neighborly and peaceful relations between Muslims and Christians. This is more true for nations like Ethiopia, where Christianity and Islam have coexisted peacefully over 14 centuries. More so, the significant role of religion is evident given that in the mundane of the daily life of Ethiopian Muslims and Ethiopian Christians, religion plays quite indisputable role. Notwithstanding the differences in suggestions and interpretations, inherent to the interreligious dialogue is the recognition that we live in mutual religious societies and that coexistence of different religious traditions is a reality one has to accept. Catherine Cornell defines interreligious dialogue as the engagement between different religion traditions oriented toward this mutual understanding and growth. Following the proposal of Cornell, the essence of dialogue is mutual understanding. At the heart of mutuality lies an effort, a consuming desire to understand others better and possibly also learn. It requires a disciplined mindset toward these others, as a religious adherence or community reflects about one's own faith and practice with the sense of friendship. As the process of mutuality in knowledge and friendship deepens, it is hoped that unfounded prejudice towards the other could be ratified. In this line of reasoning, could interreligious dialogue could the religious to hold their own commitment while also becoming open to the other with a genuine respect. The collective memories nurtured among Ethiopian Muslim activists, as well as the Christian responses, are far from the ideals of interreligious dialogue. The two conditions of interreligious dialogue, mutuality in knowledge and friendships, are missing. The other has become opponent in a contest, not a friend, but a stranger, and at times an enemy. In historical reconstruction, the other is a suspect, having a nefarious agenda that works at a still. As a result, many Christians view the recent historical reconstructions among the Muslims, the Islamization of history. In this historical reconstruction, the other is a suspect, having a nefarious agenda that works in a stills. The determination seems just to win a controversial and nuanced topics. Uncritical commitment to one's tradition and a tendency to filter contrary evidences constrains the possibility of learning from the other. The simplification of complex historical repository into one's present concern is also another problem that is being faced. Ethiopian Muslim activists' narrative core is the political marginalization of Ethiopian Muslims. Oh, sorry, the religious marginalization of Ethiopian Muslims. The economic factor and the political factors are largely ignored at the expense of promoting the religious factors in order to invoke sympathy and revitalize the Muslim community. The activists' negotiation to replace the economic with the religious factor nurtured a sense of hostility and defensiveness among Christians. So far, the collective memories advanced among the Muslim community and the response of the Christian communities are monologues rather than conversations. The approach at its worst is polemic and at its best is apologetics. If the Christian and Muslim activists join in a dialogue rather than monologue, the dialogue would have punctuated the points of connection between the conversants. The overall attitude has been not only being proud of one's religious tradition, but also unhealthily looking down at the other. The venture emulated the widely circulating Islamic religious apologists, after whom the Ethiopian Islamic activists fashioned themselves, or more correctly, polemists, who present one's face over the other as superior. The motivation or patience to respond empathically to the opinion of others and bringing assumptions into open question is still missing. The fundamentalist level of certitude beyond doubt left no room for further improvement. The activists present their alternative narratives as final rather than tentative historical reconstruction. The fundamentalist tendency to use religious texts as infallible historical sources also makes dialogue difficult. Both Christians and Muslims use their own religious traditions and texts as for historical construction. Given that the collective memory construction and sustenance is not a conversation, it suffers greatly from a void of friendship. Evidently, the direction has been asserting one's own religious tradition and sources that attest the same, thereby undermining the very objective of dialogue. Mutual understanding through sharing of knowledge and building friendship. It is not only the content of collective memories that contributed negatively to the interreligious dialogue, but also the medium. The fact that most of the collective memory construction process takes place in online context deterred positive advances. In community, the value of face-to-face interactions and technological developments, the real sense of interaction is missed. Internet as a main communication medium for historical discourse made physical contacts are necessary. In such detached contexts, including written mediums, participants abstracted and simplified ideas and dropped the nuance and complexity that characterize the Ethiopian historical materials. Internet as a medium also provided an opportunity to claim authority without having a proper credentials. The result has been assertions of one's opinion as historical fact. If dialogue should thrive, there is a necessity to create a real sense of friendship by availing venues where people physically meet and share ideas that are dear to them. With the activist approach and also with the Christian responses, the larger community is turning into a religious fan that stands with the religious celebrities. Approach that marginalize conversations among the community tend to be unhealthy since they pave ways that pecuniary interests have primacy over dialogues. Arguably, the core of interreligious dialogue lies a concern of peaceful and loving coexistence with neighbors. The overall effort is to deepen our bonds without discarding the real differences or unduly capitalizing it. Developing mutual understanding and tolerance in areas of difference would have been more possible if historical discourses are not monologues. In the context of friendship, chances are high that parties in a dialogue respectfully present differences in perspectives without dramatizing the views of the other as fictions and fables. Rather than attaching negative and offensive labels like fictions and fables, relations that nurtured friendship would have cultivated more modesty and respect. Without discounting also differences, identifying shared values should have been given more weight in the construction of the past. While certain schematic templates are inevitable in the collective memory constructions, the core of the endeavor, among others, should also include the need for establishing interface bond and finding common grounds. So by way of concluding, it is only when interfaith bonds are strengthened that unfounded prejudice and religious fanaticisms lose their fertile grounds. In this regard, the potential role that interreligious dialogue beyond therapeutic values could play a decisive role in averting conflicts from the very outset. What the reconstructionist alternative history and the reaction of the Christians lack is a historical reconstruction that is sympathetic, spiritually enriching, and yet intellectually refreshing, being true to their sources as they portray the history. Thank you very much for listening. This is what I have for you guys, and I would love to continue conversing.